So, looking to my home country of Lebanon, why everything fails, both in it and around it, and why the Middle East is such a failed place, you can find three major theories or ideas about that. The first one is that the people cannot work things out because they're not used to democratic ideals and republics and freedom. They're used to tyranny and one man's rule, and that's too big a change and too short while a change. And they compare it to Africa, where Africa as well went from these tribal leaders who had control and could just measure things out as they liked, and people just followed one man's rule and occasionally fought tribe to tribe, but then had the lasting peace because of that tribal supremacy. And it went all wrong when it became democracies and people had to vote and speak up and newspapers and all that. They weren't really geared to do that. And then while they were fighting, the colonizers had taken their riches and they came into the favor of some of their leaders to tell them, listen, I can help you with some guns, or you can maybe take over here if you give us this and that contract. And so it went by. And the same with the Middle East. And the second idea is it's not about the people and their disagreement or democracy. It's more about what they are in conflict with, and that's basically the insurgents of Israel in the area. So many people focus on the Arabic-Israeli conflict as the main root and issue for many of the trouble that's going on in the Middle East, and say that if it wasn't for the Israeli insurgents by the West and by the British at that time, 1917, and the promise of the land, and Herzl's work for the Zionist movement, and a lot of money that was given by the Rothschilds, and everything that went on in the last century before that. And if it wasn't for that, the Arabs would have made things out, because the insurgents of Israel made everything different, because they were very keen on their security and to be secure among these very huge Arab nations who didn't like them there. They had to divide them forever and cut them into pieces and always make them fight and have tyrannical rulers above them and impoverish them. So some people say it's that theory that holds. It's the conspiracy theory of the West and Israel who keeps the nations impoverished. And the third main idea, you can see why the Middle East, and I'm talking about Lebanon. Basically, I was thinking back on Lebanon in my time after the Khartoum crisis, and that's why I'm talking about this now. I was thinking, why is this happening? And the third idea I found was eligible on this road, is that the Middle East has always been like this. It has always been a stepstone for many centuries for nations that met or traded or fought. You go back to Alexander the Great and the Phoenicians. You go back to the big what can you say, the Second Temple, time of the Second Temple, and they had big trades, as the Old Testament talks about, with the Phoenicians and with the Lebanese to the north, the populations of Sur and Sidon and these places. And they found them very agreeable. At the same time, they had these big nations invading. You had the Assyrians, and then you had the Babylonians, and later on you got the Greeks and the Romans, and as I mentioned, Alexander the Great. And after him came the Romans once more and took over. Not once more, but after the Greek came the Romans, and they took over for many centuries. And sometimes you had their trouble with the Jewish communities, and many famous stories told from the Jewish perspective on that, and the revolts and fights and suppressions and the diaspora and whatever happened to the Jews. And the Arabs were just like not mentioned, because the area was under Roman rule and Roman culture and Christian culture. The Arabs were in the Arabic Peninsula, and they were in the small areas, not really a known nation. But after Islam, they became this huge empire and this very well-known group, and from there started the changes. And so even under Islam's rule, this area had never really had rest, because if you look back, you will see it had 120 years under the Umayyads. Then came the Abbasids, and during the Abbasids you got revolts, and you got areas that wanted to be independent. So the third major idea is that the Middle East have always been a stepping stone for bigger nations. And so it's not surprising that this very small nation of Lebanon and the area surrounding it and the countries surrounding it are just a stepping stone for the big fighting nations of the United States and Russia at that time, and the satellite states that worked alongside them. And so the area of Lebanon and Beirut in particular became the hub for the spies, because it was a beautiful place and it was a good place for them to be. It was like a James Bondic adventure. At the same time, it was like where everybody got their information and knew what was going on. And so it was not a coincidence that this Middle Eastern area has been the hub of bigger what can you say, empires and nations fighting over the control or influence in the area. And so to repeat three major ideas of why the trouble is always ongoing in the Middle East, in Syria and the areas around. And many people are occupied by this today, but doesn't really see the picture of why it's going on like that and what's wrong with all these people. Why do they keep fighting? And so the first idea is that it's just what can you say, it's the change, the very, very sudden change from one man's rule, from an empire to democracies, and that was too hard and too big and too strong a shift, also into nationalism that tried to gain back that glory of the one man and the strong leader, as the Arabs were used to and the area was used to several thousand years back. The second one is the insurgence of Israel and the trouble that made in the Arabic mentality, and the trauma that brought along with it, in their opinion, forgetting that the Israelis also were a traumatized people and needed to find back to their glories after 2,000 years of dreaming and waiting on God's help and support. And so they got it, but that became a traumatic experience for the area around them as well. And the third idea is that, well, it's big nations, and the place is a stepping stone for big nations, and having satellite states and influential politics in those small areas. And so when they don't agree, they fight internally, and that becomes what's called the guerrilla wars, or the satellite fighters, and people fighting on behalf of the bigger nations. Proxies, I believe it's called. It's like fighting without be interfering directly from the big nations, because that could be dangerous. You could trigger a nuclear war. And so that's why Lebanon got stuck in all of this. It was the hub for spies, and it was the place where the Palestinians went and could have a free area of fighting back. And some say it's altogether a package. All three ideas have been shaping the Middle East since then. And you can imagine, like, the Sunnites, who had been the most large group, and the Sunnites are many groups and ideas, but if you can compare them to, like, the minority of the Shiites at that time and the minority of the Druze and Alawites, they were by far the biggest group that has existed and has controlled the areas. And that's what made it also in a troublesome situation. Then you have the small Christian minority that suddenly saw the light, and the Alawites who saw the light and became a strong and influential nation and took over the Alawites took over Syria, and they were also, there was a plan in the 1960s, 1910 to 1916, to establish an Alawite state and a Christian state, Maronite state, alongside Israel, or before Israel were there, but I mean on the same shore. And so as you can see, it failed. But then the Alawites took over the rule in Syria. even though it was a Sunni majority and the Shiite minority, and they're all proud people with a long history of feeling important and having many things to look back at. And the same with the Shiites, even though they were a small minority, suddenly they had a space and a place in Iran, and that meant they could widen their influence. And the same goes for the bigger nations. They wanted allies in the area, and so everyone allied up with one team or another. And if someone had an ally in Lebanon or Syria or Jordan, and the others didn't, they wanted to do the same. But then Jordan won one-sidedly over the PLO and in Black September 1970, and that's what made the kingdom like follow its own agenda and rule of the kingship, of course, and following what they see fit in politics without this internal interference. That couldn't happen in Lebanon because of the many fractions, and that's why they never got this one-sided solution as the Jordanians could, and then they got much more peace, even though they still have some trouble internally, but not the same as happened to Lebanon. And in Syria, you got a 40 years of what was looking like peace on the surface, but is really suppression underneath the surface, and those roots went also to influence the relations with Iraq, with Egypt, and not the less with Lebanon. And the Israelis were also like concerned about their security, has been for so many years. So they were looking at how to keep these nations away from them. And of course, if you were looked at as an enemy, what would you do? And you have the power to do it. You would divide everyone around you. So we go back to that logic of Assad saying to that politicians who visit him, say, why are you keeping your friend in prison? The friend of the five officers who made the revolution possible in 1967. Why are you keeping him there to rot? Well, he would do the same to me, he said. So this is the logic of the cynicism of the area and the politics that's going about in there. And in such spaces and areas, it's not easy to have idealism and to have the roots of development and freedom and cultural aspirations, and being such a nation that could bring prosperity. And that's, in my idea, the basic three reasons for why the Middle East is in such a state. First and foremost, it's a sudden change in culture and borders that came from the Versailles Treaty. Secondly, it's the insurgence of Israel. And the third is that big powers have been playing games with these small people and nations, and it's a stepping stone for these big powers as it has been for centuries. I don't know if I'm right on, but that was my conclusion at the time I was thinking about these things, and to understand who I was and where I came from and why my region and area is how it is. And for the solutions, well, everyone is trying different solutions, and I don't know if they're succeeding. Some wants the Israelis out, and then they think, well, everything will go better. And some say, let's go just with one empire. Should we be pro-American or pro-Russian? And that will solve everything. And others says, let's go back to our roots, to the king or to the emperor or sultan or caliph, or one big leader that we understand, and one big majority that leads us with minorities within it. And some wants to go back to the Islamic religious roots, other wants to go back all the way to the pre-Islamic Arabic roots, and some wants to go back to a state in between. They want a modern state, a modern place, but build on these roots and traditions. So you can see no agreement, no coherence, and no one-way direction to go to. So it's a troublesome pit, and I don't know how it will end. It looks like there is no clear and easy end in sight, unless everything is wiped out and then people start anew, and that's also a catastrophic and a disaster for the world. But maybe history is like that, and that's what tragedies are there for, to reset, and everything starts over. And maybe one empire will take over and just rule, like what happened with the Roman Empire. They will just dominate, and they will put their rules through, and and nothing more will happen, and peace will grow underneath that, in one way or another, one shape or another. So yeah, that's the history of the cedar and the Lebanese in all this area as I see it. I try to understand it as a Lebanese person who were brought up in the West and was thinking back on his nation and tried to visit it, understand it.